Hi, I'm Mike Wolf. I'm the acting director of the Mike Downs Center for Indiana Politics. And I'd like to welcome everybody to a year-end review of Indiana politics with the research associates of the Mike Downs Center for Indiana Politics, whom I'd like to introduce right now. I'm Wolf, so I'm going to go in reverse alphabetical order. And the first is Dr. Laura Merrifield Wilson, Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Indianapolis. Dr. Matthew Hanka, Associate Professor of Political Science, University of Southern Indiana, and Dr. Elizabeth Bennion, Chancellor's Professor of Political Science, Indiana University, South Bend. I'd like to thank the production team here at College TV Fort Wayne and all of our media partners, and it's a real pleasure here. I also like to say that Dr. Robert Diane, who's also a research associate, won't be with us today. We'd like to do this more frequently as we head into the new year. And as always, thank you to the emeritus and founding director of the Mike Downs Center of Indiana Politics, Andrew Downs. So I'd like to start here with a question about the 2022 Indiana legislative session, which is normally the short session, but we had a little bit of an added on in the summer following the need for in the view of the governor, a tax return, but also the supermajority Republicans wanted to also pass legislation relative to abortion. I was wondering what you think the political consequences of this additional special session will be and was.
Well, we're already seeing some of those consequences play out right now as the Indiana State Supreme Court has said they will take up the abortion case. It's funny because if you think of the special summer session, I think more Hoosiers remember that than we necessarily do the regular session that we always have because of what came out of that. And there'll certainly be implications. It's not coincidental, but of course, the state Supreme Court hearing those oral arguments at the same time that our state legislature is meeting, and of course, budgeting year in terms of the importance there, having that kind of overlap. We've heard about abortion. I don't expect that policy is going away. And it was obviously a major talking point for Indiana politics this year.
At the same time, I don't expect in the 2023 session of the Indiana General Assembly that we'll see actual changes to the abortion policy passed during the special session. There will certainly be pressure from Indiana Right to Life to close the loopholes or exceptions that are included in the law. But with the current legislation being in front of the court, many of the legislative leaders will be reluctant to do anything more with that topic until we see what is happening with the current legislation.
Great. What do you think? This might be a little political sciencey here, but I mean, this is a constitutionally defined set of days for these sessions, and we have a non-professional legislature. Is this setting a precedent for every time a cultural issue comes down the pike that we'll be maybe opening a special session in the summer at another time of the year?
Well, it somewhat shifts a lot of the priority. I think Dr. Wilson's right. People are going to remember the actions that happened in this special session. So does it mean we have to rethink how we look at a non-professional legislature? There's something, and a lot of us observe Indiana politics and observe Kentucky politics and any other political systems as non-professional. There's a pace to what goes on that sometimes is so hurried or slow or whatever that it does affect the flow of legislation, affects the outcomes. That you're racing to the clock, racing to sine die, and other states who don't have that problem have different outcomes. And so does it force us to pause? I'm not sure if Indiana will change a lot of that or some other states that might do it, but you have just a new precedent may force us to sort of rethink how does this work. We've observed sessions where we end early. You know, Kentucky's notorious across the river, across the Ohio, for stopping the clock at 11:58, so they don't reach that point where everything must end at that moment in time on that particular day as prescribed by the Constitution. So, you know, we're not maybe not see it soon, but maybe a healthy conversation or dialogue or discourse about, hey, when these things happen, we have to address them, and addressing them through different ways than we've been doing it might be better.
I think one thing to keep in mind, though, in terms of setting a precedent, is that this was an historic decision by the Supreme Court that meant that abortion came up at all. That is not something that you see a reversal of a 50-year precedent every day, and something that the legislators had long been saying, once this happens, we want to address it immediately. So it happened outside of session. Also, in terms of the economy, following up on a large pandemic and then having a record surplus, so that even the tax refunds that are triggered by law weren't seen as enough by the legislature, and the high inflation rate. And so a lot of it had to do with context. I think many of the legislators, including legislators in the majority party, are very reluctant to move away from a part-time legislature toward a more professionalized legislature. So I think there will still be a lot of resistance to making this a routine, standardized thing in the future.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Great, awesome, thank you. Moving here, I mean, from what was a consequential legislative session, particularly in the summer additional, to the really consequential 2022 elections. And I thought, wanted to discuss what you think the main takeaways were from the statewide elections in Indiana in 2022.
I would say Indiana is very red. Indiana and the Republicans did very well on election night. That Todd Young won his re-election bid for Senate by over 20 points, and most of it was predicted. But a lot of those of our 9 members of the House of Representatives, 7 are Republican, and they won by very sizable majorities. That's entrenching 8th district down here. Dr. Larry Bouchon won by 30 points. So they're solidifying that Republican base. That red is getting darker in Indiana, so it doesn't bode well for a lot of Democrats who want to compete for these federal offices statewide.
To add on to that, oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Laura.
I was going to say, I think Dr. Honk is right. The state is very red, and it seems that we saw a lot of straight ticket voting, and you could notice that for the 3 statewide executive offices. If you look at treasurer, auditor, and then secretary of state, which was arguably the most exciting race in the state this year, and many thought could be competitive. By all measures, it looked like something that could be an opportunity for Democrats to win. And then they lose by a 14% margin. But there's only 5% or so that was roll off between those who cast a ballot for the Republican candidate for auditor, those who cast a ballot for the Republican candidate for treasurer, and then those who abstained, most likely based on the numbers, or voted for the Libertarian candidate for the Secretary of State. We're one of 6 states that allows straight ticket voting at the top, where you just simply indicate which party you want to support and you are done with your ballot. I think that question might be revisited, understanding, of course, the people in power are oftentimes those who benefit from it. So the likelihood for change may not be there, but straight ticket voting was definitely prevalent in this last election cycle.
I think looking at the contest for Secretary of State is very telling, because if we look at that auditor and treasurer rate, we see 60 to 61% of voters casting their votes for Republicans. In contrast, for Secretary of State, just a little over 54%. So there certainly were some people who may have voted straight ticket otherwise who decided not to do it, given the scandal-plagued campaign of Diego Morales. But some of the headlines that came out of that were things like a good Democrat, a bad Republican beats a good Democrat in Indiana. And we can debate over how we define good and how we define bad, but certainly that was the Democrats' best chance to compete in a statewide race. And we saw even there, they couldn't do it, and they didn't even really in the end come very close. So it's incredibly challenging for the party in terms of thinking about the future and how they're going to be able to compete statewide.
Yeah, and I want to touch on this a little bit, because the political science often discusses the effects of midterm elections, and that the president's party wouldn't be favored at all. But at the same time, this is a nearly a decade-long run of Republicans doing well in statewide elections, no matter what the context of the competition is. So what do you think the future here is, and can Democrats compete statewide, even if they're recruiting good candidates, by the way, as I think you were talking about?
I think that in the near future, certainly it would be a major uphill battle. If we think about where Democrats have done surprisingly well in Indiana statewide, we almost have to go back in history. Certainly during my time living and working in Indiana, we had a Democratic controlled state house. We had Democratic and Republican governors, but it's been a while now and Republicans have widened their lead. And so it suggests that there have to be some major contextual factors at play, such as 2008, when Obama actually won the state and its electoral votes in the presidential race. But we have to remember that was a case where there was a huge recession at play. The unemployment rate in parts of Indiana, including Elkhart County here up north, was over 25%. And so that was a time when people really were looking for change. And you had field offices across the state set up by the Obama campaign, whereas McCain really didn't campaign in the state, assumed it would go red and made a miscalculation. But it takes that kind of serious shock and people really being willing to make a change to potentially change the political dynamics of the state or immigration and outmigration patterns. But that seems unlikely.
You know, in addition to infrastructure, as Dr. Binion's saying, you also need issues. And it feels like the statewide party hasn't been able to quite find that right balance of issues that speak to voters to get them on their side. Historically, we have had that. But you saw the erosion of the Democratic Party, particularly in the rural parts of the state. And they just haven't been able to connect and resonate, I think, with those voters in the same way. You can be dominant in the 1st and the 7th congressional district, in those heavily urban areas of the region in Indianapolis, but that's not the whole state. And that, of course, won't be enough to be successful for a statewide office, too.
And what Dr. Wilson and Dr. Benion said, that yes, the issues are extremely important, and it doesn't matter, even if we see 2024 being a positive year for Joe Biden. Let's say Joe Biden does have a somewhat clearer path to re-election, or Dems are doing well. It doesn't mean that the Republican brand is faulty, even if the Republicans follow Trumpism or do it. That's not, it's going to be punishing Trump and Trumpism, not so much the Republican Party. So a lot of the we're not Trump or the Trumpers or we're not this brand of the Republican Party is not going to be sufficient enough. Yes, it's possible we could see, what we saw with the surprise at the midterms of the Democrats gaining or not losing as many seats in the House, holding on to the Senate was good. That's not going to necessarily trickle down to Indiana very much, unless, has been said by my colleagues, we really have to focus on issues that matter, and that's always been a blind spot the last several election cycles for Democrats. Just because we don't like the other guy, the opposite side, that's not compelling enough. And most of these areas in India haven't been compelled by the opposite message. They're following what's been working for them.
Right. So, I mean, what do you think then in the short, medium, long term for party competition, the state of the Democratic Party in the state?
I think they need to build their bench more. And that's the challenge that is tasked for Mike Schmuhl right now, being in charge of the party, but having a wide range of really high quality candidates. So ideally, someone who served in a different level of public office. They know how to run a campaign. They are electable, they're likable. They have a war chest and name recognition. But now I'm just naming the ideal candidate. That's not necessarily realistic for every race. But to have a bench of strong suitors that when we talk about the 2024 gubernatorial race, just like we talk about for Republicans, where we can name one person that's already declared and at least a handful of others that are fundraising and look like they're going to make that declaration soon, to be able to say that for the Democratic Party as well. We talked about issues and infrastructure, and those are vital too. I think the party's had a number of challenging election cycles. It just hasn't seemed to be able to recover in the same way. But good competition is good for everyone, and it brings out better candidates for both sides. It increases voter turnout, engagement, and interest. And I genuinely believe it helps both political parties because they recognize they need to step up their game. They can't just rely on being a party in power in a certain way or having certain demographics. It really is advantageous for democracy. And quite frankly, competition is necessary for it too.
it may be necessary, and I agree that it's advantageous in all the ways just described. But the problem is that good candidates are strategic candidates and candidates who are high quality, who have the ability to build a strong following, to fundraise, who come with a war chest, et cetera, don't want to throw their hat into the ring for races where they are almost certain to lose. And so it is a vicious cycle for a party that is a minority party to try to win seats. Similarly, in the state legislature, we see with gerrymandering, the party in power increases their margin of victory. I know Democrats were hopeful about breaking the super majority in the House. Of course, that didn't happen either. And once you have a party in power, they have an opportunity to do things that increase their advantage and make it even more difficult to compete.
Great, awesome. I think I hear the books behind you guys speaking out loud. It's pretty nice to hear. So on the opposite side, the Republican Party is the majority party. That's now clearly statewide elections, et cetera. But we saw some bubbling up of different wings of the party this year. So the cultural conservative elements, some of the Trump elements, and some of maybe the more mainline Republicanism in some of the real election victories this year. And so what does that mean for the Republican Party, though, if we see some different wings popping up and making different noises and taking the party in different direction?
I think in many ways, what we see at the state level is the same as what we're seeing nationally, which is that the party is trying to find its identity and decide how it can continue to have the support of people who support Trumpism without Trump, and also think about how to field candidates that will win general elections. If we look at the fact that Joe Biden is the first president since Franklin Roosevelt, to actually not lose seats in the Senate during a midterm election of this type, that suggests that some of the candidates the GOP put forward were not that palatable to voters, in part because election denial became a litmus test for being part of the party, should that be the case. And so you do see things like certainly Senator Braun and Representative Spartz and others who voted against the CHIPS Act. That's very different than Senator Young, who says this is important for jobs in the country and potential jobs in Indiana. We need to move manufacturing jobs to the U.S. and ideally to Indiana as well. That, we need these big bipartisan infrastructure bills, manufacturing bills, et cetera. And that's a very different approach, and one that some Republicans, but not all Republicans, are taking. And there certainly is division in the electorate as well as among the party in government. And so we're seeing that also reflected here in Indiana. It is interesting that Senator Braun seems to have moved more to the right over his time in office rather than toward the center, and now has announced that he will run for governor. So his reading of the state must be that more conservative culture is going to be more popular with Indiana Republicans. I guess we'll see if that plays out.
Mm-hmm.
And Senator Braun running as governor will likely have competition. So maybe it's very apt that he would move to be more conservative, considering there'll probably be competition in the primary for that gubernatorial race. I think you're absolutely right, Dr. Binion. You see that division within the party. And it's easy to take for granted that Republicans do dominate in the statewide offices, in the state legislature, and just in Indiana as a whole. But you still see those divisions, not even at the federal offices. But if you look at the state, Governor Holcomb versus the state legislature, Governor Holcomb versus Attorney General Todd Rokita. There's a lot of maybe personal politics divisions, but certainly ideological political divisions too. And it's always the burden of the party in power. They have to be able to reconcile the far right from the moderate right, from the slightly right. just like the Democrats do. Of course, they don't have the onus of being in that position, but I think that's exactly what we're seeing play out right now, and will continue to do so in the next few election cycles.
Yeah, you have a good point, Dr. Benya, because we have, with any of our political figures who statewide, how they look at being elected governor or senator. It's just a different lens. And so Senator Braun might see, okay, how I am acting as senator and aligning with this Trumpism side may not play out as effectively as I want versus coming home. He might, now that it's a clear minority in the Senate, yeah, he's certainly going to be a thorn in Minority Leader McConnell's side. Is that going to be enough? Is that part of that wing going to be silenced out? It's possible that it's entirely possible the Republicans, if they see a future national leader, they try to weed that out, and he doesn't want to be the one that's sort of on the losing side of it, which is probably one of his calculations for not running for re-election. Coming back home, he's got great chances of being governor.
Yeah, I think he would have a fairly easy win if he chose to stand for re-election in the Senate. It sounds like people close to him, similarly to folks close to a political figure like Pete Buttigieg, say this is a person who prefers executive office to legislative office and being one of many. And so I think there are a number of considerations there.
Yeah, I think that's a good point too. One of 100 versus you being the one in charge. But yeah, it's very enticing to want to do that. But Braun has done a very good job of establishing himself as one of those voices that defended Trump. We saw that in the impeachment trial. He emerged as that. But yes, and you're right. He would win re-election, but would his voice and the way he's positioned himself as that kind of Republican in the Senate might not be as effective. So which is coming home to run. Yeah, he would win either way, but yeah, he probably might have a bigger showing running for governor.
What could be interesting there is to see how he embraces Donald Trump now, given this last primary election cycle for Republicans. As we've already noted, those that got the Trump endorsement were not necessarily successful. So it tells you maybe that brand is weakening a little bit, or maybe it was specific to this election cycle. But he really did embrace Donald Trump when he was originally elected to the Senate, and that was part of what separated him from Rokita and Messer in the primary. So to see it's the same constituency in terms of the Senate and governor, obviously different positions. I agree. I think he's more inclined to an executive office. But how Trump plays a role in this, how he models his candidacy and using that, I think that will be interesting to watch.
Yeah. So we've talked about these individual politicians, and there's never a shortage of ambition, clearly. And we talked about the bench here on the Democratic side. Well, clearly the bench on the Republican side with an open governor seat and likely an open Senate seat because of that open governor seat. Clearly some of the executive positions in the state are also interested in the upper level positions, and members of the Congress are probably going to throw their hat in for that Senate seat. What does this mean for Republican politics, and actually, not just the individual people, but for the policy that's going to be championed as people kind of jockey for positions as they move forward? What do you think this is going to mean for policy?
I think it's going to be interesting to see those ideological divisions that have to be reconciled. If we go back to the special summer session in terms of abortion, there was a lot of closed door discussion we're not privy to, but what kind of exceptions, what exemptions, what kind of context would we allow for and what would we not? And that's ultimately what we saw coming in the resulting legislation. Though they don't have to focus just on that policy, I imagine the primary races, we would expect to see many candidates. These will be competitive open seats. So those questions will come up. And for voters in the primary, of course, they're going to be more ideologically extreme, but I think they will want to know. So where do you stand on these issues, the nuanced differences? The party struggles of any time they're in office making those decisions from a policy perspective, but it's really called into play for accountability when you're seeking to be reelected or you're seeking election in the first place. So it feels like the moment of truth from a public accountability perspective, where you are going to have to publicly and on the record and visibly reconcile the differences within the party in a way that's palatable, of course, for primary voters. You got to win that one. But then looking long term to have a candidate that's going to be able to stand up in the general election too.
It's going to be a uphill battle for Democrats to win statewide in Indiana. For Democrats, for Senate, it's possible Joe Donnelly can try to reclaim his seat. He's currently the U.S. ambassador to the Holy See of the Vatican. He may want to reclaim that since he sees an opening from a seat he once had. In terms of the governor, yeah, there's going to be a lot of jockeying on the Republican side. It's just as we've kind of been saying earlier, you got to have that message, and is it and issues is it going to resonate? And there's just sometimes a resonate. Yeah, it's the same constituencies, but maybe it works in the Senate because we've got a Democratic president and a slim majority, but when it comes here and we see how conservative and the strong connection with the Republican base here, it's gonna be the biggest uphill battle to get somebody elected statewide for governor.
Excellent. So beyond policy, obviously, then we also looking kind of Indiana's complexion on the national scene. We have a lot of figures that kind of have broken through recently. We talked about Senator Young and the CHIPS Act. I think Representative Banks is the chair of the Conservative Caucus, taking over the majority in the House, will likely get a really good perch here as a national power player. We have Pete Buttigieg, obviously the Vice President Pence. We have a lot of people kind of playing different roles on the national scene. I was wondering what you think of their futures and what do you think that means for Indiana?
Pence is an interesting situation because it sort of seems like he might run, but he has to balance. It's a little bit of sometimes problems with vice presidents running for president anyway, but he's certainly going to have to detach himself from all the unseemly things of Trump and Trumpism while saying, hey, while I was vice president, I did some things that I can show that I can do this job. I'm not sure if a lot of voters, especially some of the ones who still align the base with Trump, are gonna buy into that. Is he expected to run? Yes, but will he have a terrible time doing so? I think there's going to be others like Ron DeSantis who will put and say you can't have it both ways. Pete Buttigieg will be interesting. He certainly has a future. I'm not sure if the ticket gets disrupted the second time around, where Vice President or President Biden drops Vice President Harris for somebody else. It would be sort of intriguing just to see Buttigieg on the ticket. It may not be this cycle, but certainly he's got that position, and whether he might serve in another cabinet post if Biden's reelected, maybe something even more high profile than what he has, which has been a pretty decent profile, being transportation secretary, where he's been visible when there's been issues affecting our transportation system, and he was one of the ones that certainly helped sell that infrastructure bill.
And I think Representative Biggs fell short of the whip position for the GOP, but we may see him run for the Senate seat vacated by Senator Braun. And so we certainly have not seen the last of him in terms of high-profile national politics. In terms of Pete Buttigieg, with the change in the Democrats' primary calendar, it would be very difficult for him to compete at the level that he did last time in terms of those early caucus and primary victories. Of course, he won the Iowa caucus, which was a big accomplishment for a mayor from a relatively small city. But we see that Iowa now really won't be a player in the primary process, being kicked out of that early. Now, ultimately, they could have an unsanctioned primary. It is state law that determines those dates, but the Democrats would not need to recognize their delegates if they did that. So with South Carolina going first, of course, there's a lot of debate about that, being a Republican state, of what that means for the general election, but it is a nod to the importance and power and faithfulness in many ways of African-American voters It also, Nevada being paired with New Hampshire means New Hampshire will not get the attention that it's gotten in the past, a place where Buttigieg placed second in the first in the nation primary in New Hampshire. And so that kind of repeat by trying to build that early momentum in Iowa and New Hampshire would not be a strategy that he could follow this time around. And so there would be it would be more of an uphill challenge in terms of doing well and building that early momentum than it was last time around. On the other hand, being the head of a department that really is in charge of implementing a $1 trillion infrastructure plan is a good thing. Trying to deal with a major national railroad strike and avert an economic crisis that could see, he claims, the auto industry shutting down, people boiling their water as water treatment plants can't get the supplies they need, and 750,000 people being laid off. This is a major issue. The crisis has been averted, but that does mean that he may lose some popularity with unions. Although he certainly can say, and I supported the sick leave policy bill that should have gone and that the House passed but was defeated in the Senate. So there will be some bridges to mend there perhaps, but he has shown some ability to deal with huge national crises. And of course, this does build his national profile and his network. So whether he'll be on a ticket now or in the future, I think we certainly haven't seen the last of him in terms of high profile national politics.
That's true.
And how cool is it that we have someone on the Democratic side and the Republican side that rises to a comparable level of national attention? I think it shows that the state can be a breeding ground for great leadership and authority. And even though we are a very red state, and as we've said, Republican dominated, you can rise to the top in other ways. I think it's always good for a state to get that kind of recognition, and especially the fact that we have people on both sides of the aisle that can do that. Is to maybe the state's political culture, maybe some of the individuals that are involved in politics. I'm sure there are a lot of other attributes, but it is to the state's credit as a whole.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think as Hoosiers, we hope these figures can flex and bring some of this home for us in the CHIPS Act and transportation and infrastructure, but that's a normative point. So I wanted to move forward a little bit more to talk about really kind of the nuts and bolts for Hoosiers. And what are the kind of economic situations, and how will that play out this year, do you think, in policy both at the state and the national economy? How are politicians going to deal with this? What do you think is going to happen as we move forward here?
I think one of the things we'll see in terms of the Indiana General Assembly during this budget year is an attempt to filter more grants to local governments to deal with infrastructure, and particularly with affordable housing and the affordable housing crisis that we're seeing across the state. Also, some additional tax cuts are certainly not off the table. There was already a tax cut package in addition to those tax refunds to taxpayers that will be phased in over 7 years, the last tax cut package. But I know that the GOP is eyeing some additional tax cuts, such as property tax relief for homeowners and property owners, but also some business equipment tax reductions, really with an eye toward the continuing inflation and how they can help to address that issue. And so I think we'll see push in those directions, as well as this continued need to provide a skilled workforce for the jobs of the future, the present and the future. And that really does mean having relevant courses in high school that can help people to succeed in the trades, but also to go on to 4-year degrees and other professional post-secondary educational opportunities. What that will look like is unclear, but it is clear that there is going to be a focus on how to make high schools as useful as possible in creating a workforce that can attract high-paying jobs to the state.
Workforce development has been essential as part of Governor Eric Holcomb's plan, and this is his last budgeting session. I agree. I think housing affordability and availability, especially after the housing task force and the impending crisis that we see in cities across Indiana, that will be front and center. And also economic development, because that's something that I believe Holcomb wants to see as his legacy. This is his last budgeting session to do that. And these are issues that really do impact just about everyone across the state. Without a doubt, these are going to be two really big things that the state legislature has to address. And they're very ideological in a way that I think isn't always intuitive. But if you talk about housing affordability and availability, our state doesn't have a lot of protections for renters, for example. And that's because some have that perspective that that's not the state's right. That's not the state's responsibility. The government shouldn't be involved in that. And so we don't have the same level of legislation and policy oversight that other states do have. And it's certainly playing into the crisis. There are a lot of other factors too. I don't know that that is the thing Holcomb wants to address in the state legislature this year as he works with governor and his legislative priorities, but I think it's something that will be very important and come up. And I think workforce development, again, because that's essential to his administration as he does his last two little years, his last two laps, if you will. Those are the things he'll focus on. Absolutely.
Excellent. So these kind of meat and potato issues, and you should be the focus of this session, but what about some of the more divisive cultural issues nationally? Again, are they going to come in and kind of blow these away a little bit, or do you think this is a year where the politics kind of stabilize and we can address some of these housing, education, hopefully higher education issues as well, and move forward?
Yeah, I think we will not see a lot of traction. There will be bills, as there always are, in part for symbolic reasons and to play well with primary voters. But there will be bills put forward on more divisive social issues, but we're unlikely to see major movement. If you look at public opinion polls, legalizing marijuana for medicinal use and or recreational use is actually supported by the majority of Hoosiers, but we're very unlikely, I think, to see that move further than it has in the past. In this particular year, I also don't expect to see much happen with additional abortion legislation. The kinds of compromises that the Republicans did before releasing that final version of the restrictions on abortion access in Indiana really reflected public opinion polls in many ways, where a majority of Hoosiers actually did not support a total ban that wouldn't include the exceptions that are included now in the law, rape and incest and life of the mother in particular. And so you have crafted legislation that more closely matches Hoosier public opinion than it will if they continue to go further, plus it's still in front of the court. In terms of things like the content in classrooms, the anti-divisive issues legislation, or so-called anti-CRT bills, we may see some of that. I suspect that it wouldn't advance, although that's certainly something that folks in K through 12 and higher education are paying attention to, because we have seen this move forward in other states. And budget years, they like to focus especially on the budget, and there is a lot to focus on there.
That's a good point. Higher education, maybe some emphasis, because it sounds like there's more of a unified voice among the public universities towards budget asks. It sounds like, from what I hear, there's probably more one voice of because maybe a lot of people this may not know that, but they've done, when the Indiana Commission on Higher Education was doing a poll and finding out that Hoosiers who want to attend college dropped to a 53%, down from 65. That's concerning. What does that tell you? That 4 out of every 9 Indiana high school students are not seeking 2 or 4 year pathways in Indiana schools. Does it mean that they're all not going to college? No, there could be some things where maybe they're leaving out of state, but that might be something that gets gets discussed enough. But I hear of a more unified sort of approach with respect to funding, and because this is a budget year, everyone probably, I assume all the public universities want to be on the same page in getting their funding asks and follow the performance funding. But yeah, that's a crisis point that the Indiana Commission of Higher Education is going to have to address if fewer Hoosiers are seeing that. Now, does that dovetail into the overall workforce development strategy of how does it play into that? Is going to be a part of that. Hopefully, it's discussed in this session.
Yeah, and I think it's a really important point that lobbyists in higher education are trying to make for legislatures and aren't always sure if the legislators are understanding the connection to high paid jobs like the jobs that could be created through the CHIPS Act. When you have other states like Ohio get huge multi-billion dollar contracts, um, when you're talking about millions and millions, multi-million dollar contracts that don't come to Indiana, that is an issue for us. And the problem is the educated workforce. So while we need more career and technical education and think about the quality of that and how to match people with jobs that may not require post-secondary education or may require more short-term certificate or journeyman programs, it has to be a both and, not either or, because many of the jobs that we're seeing that really are those good high paid jobs in high demand, and some of which are even coming with support from the federal government, are those high tech jobs, and you need a 4-year degree or more to be able to work in those particular industries. And so it's one thing to have a favorable tax environment for business, but businesses also need that workforce. And so I think that's a really important point for all of the legislators to keep in mind as they think broadly about workforce development and how to be competitive in a global economy.
And that's a good point, just even framing it as sort of a both and rather than either or. And there has been sort of a rather limited, narrower scope at looking at workforce development and readying our workforce through sort of, okay, those 2-year degrees will get you to these particular jobs. And if the legislature and the governor can sort of broaden that, that helps. And maybe that's the higher education community makes a greater case. And I think they're ready to make more of that concerted case that I don't know is a fall on deaf ears or just somehow hasn't been heard. That disconnect needs to be sort of closed better for, as you said, the future of Indiana's economy.
Excellent. One other thing related to this, and we're obviously maybe a little bit biased toward higher education. What about K through 12? We discussed the property tax kind of component, which is a main funding source. We've also discussed the teacher shortage in a sense, and the push over the last few years about teacher pay. I mean, for K through 12, what do you see as all of these kind of intersection points for K through 12 is funding and the demands that really have been pushed for over the last few years? Do you see this as a place, and particularly this session?
Well, it'll have to be addressed, certainly given that it's a budget session, but the irony that all these topics are recycled, that none of these are new, and there's still challenges that we see. But with regards to teacher pay, for example, we had a budget surplus, but we give people back some of their tax dollar money. We recognize people don't want to go into education. K through 12 education is very difficult. We are losing teachers that do choose to pursue a career in that area. And they're being asked in many ways to do more. We had in there too the impact of COVID on children and how we've seen that impact test scores and the lingering concerns about getting kids back up to speed, and not just academically, of course, there are social and emotional components too. So we ask teachers to do more essentially, and we're not necessarily compensating them. And we see that reflected in the number of people that both go into the profession and the number of people that continually leave that. Just focusing on that metric alone, I think that is something that will come up in the state legislature. Now, there's ideological and partisan concerns, and that might mean the needle doesn't move that much. It's the reason why we have this topic as a conversation annually. But it's still one that remains to be addressed. It hasn't been addressed effectively, and that's why it is still here.
Right.
Excellent, excellent. Well, we're going to be addressing these issues a little more frequently with the Mike Down Center for Indiana Politics and our awesome research associates who so impressively handled everything today. And so we'll probably cut it off here, but a lot of these issues are going to come back up. We're going to continue to discuss them. And really want to thank the College TV Fort Wayne for their awesome production here and the great contributions, again, of Dr. Laura Merrifield Wilson, Dr. Matthew Honka, and Dr. Elizabeth Benyon. This has been we've covered a lot of territory, and we're going to be back and getting under the hood in the new year as well. So thank you very much.